A greedy family is left shocked and outraged when their eccentric millionaire father leaves his entire fortune to his beloved dog. Charles Finch paced the opulent living room of his father's mansion, his face a mask of impatience and barely concealed greed. "Where's that lawyer?" he growled, glaring at his wife, Veronica. The Finch family, Charles, Veronica, and their two children, Tiffany and Chad, had gathered for the reading of Archibald Finch's will. The air in the room crackled with tension, a palpable mixture of anticipation and avarice. Archie, the eccentric millionaire known for his quirky nature and deep love for animals, had passed away unexpectedly, leaving behind a vast fortune and a legacy shrouded in mystery. Charles ran his fingers through his thinning hair, a habit born of frustration. He'd been estranged from his father for years, their relationship fractured by Charles's relentless pursuit of wealth and Archie's dedication to animal welfare. Now, as he stood in the very room where countless arguments had erupted, Charles felt a flicker of doubt. His father was known for his unusual whims, and even in death, Archie might have one last surprise up his sleeve. Veronica's manicured nails tapped an impatient rhythm on the antique mahogany side table. "Darling, do try to calm yourself," she purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We wouldn't want to appear overeager." Their children, Tiffany and Chad, sprawled on the plush leather sofa, engrossed in their smartphones. Tiffany, barely glancing up, whined, "How much longer do we have to wait? I have plans, you know." Chad snorted, not bothering to look away from his game. "Yeah, like maxing out another credit card." Before Tiffany could retort, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion. Charles's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "Finally," he muttered, striding towards the foyer. Bartholomew Higgins stood in the doorway, his weathered face a mask of professional detachment. The lawyer's salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his suit, though not as expensive as Charles's, was impeccably pressed. In his hand, he carried a worn leather briefcase that held the key to the Finch family's future. "Good afternoon, Charles," Bart said, his voice steady and measured. "I trust you and your family are well." Charles's attempt at a welcoming smile came across as more of a grimace. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries, Higgins. We all know why you're here." Bart's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, but he nodded and followed Charles into the living room. The family had rearranged themselves, presenting a united front as Bart took his seat in an armchair across from them. "Before we begin," Bart said, opening his briefcase, "I want to express my condolences for your loss. Archibald was not only my client, but a dear friend." Charles waved his hand dismissively. Yes, we're all very sad. Now, can we get on with it?" Bart's lips thinned, but he pulled out a thick envelope and broke the seal. The room fell silent as he unfolded the document, the rustle of paper the only sound in the tense atmosphere. "I, Archibald Finch, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament," Bart began, his voice clear and steady. The family leaned forward, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Charles's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white as he waited for the words that would secure his future. Bart continued reading, detailing minor bequests to various animal charities and longtime employees. With each name that wasn't their own, the Finch family's impatience grew. Tiffany huffed loudly, while Chad muttered under his breath about stupid mutts. Finally, Bart reached the section they'd all been waiting for. He paused, his eyes scanning the words before him, and for a moment, a flicker of something, surprise, amusement, crossed his face. "And now, to the matter of my estate, including my mansion, my investments, and all remaining assets," Bart read, his voice taking on a slightly bemused tone. "I hereby leave everything, in its entirety, to my beloved golden retriever Max." The room exploded into chaos. Veronica's shriek pierced the air, while Tiffany and Chad's voices rose in a cacophony of disbelief and outrage. But it was Charles who reacted most violently, leaping to his feet, his face contorted in fury. "This is preposterous," Charles roared, advancing on Bart. "You can't be serious. A dog? He left everything to a damn dog?" Bart remained calm, holding up a hand to stem the tide of anger. "There's more, Charles. Please sit down and allow me to finish." Charles loomed over Bart, his breath coming in short, angry bursts. For a moment, it seemed he might lunge at the lawyer, but Veronica's hand on his arm pulled him back. "Let him finish, darling," she hissed. "There must be some mistake." Reluctantly, Charles sank back onto the sofa, his eyes burning with barely contained rage. Bart cleared his throat and continued reading. "In the event that Max should pass away within 1 year of my death, the estate will be divided equally among my son Charles and his family." Bart read, his voice carefully neutral. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications of this clause sank in. Charles's expression shifted, the fury giving way to a calculating gleam that sent a chill down Bart's spine. "So, all we have to do is wait for the mutt to kick the bucket, and it's all ours?" Chad asked, breaking the silence. Veronica shot her son a warning glance before turning to Bart with a saccharine smile. "Surely there must be some provision for Max's care? After all, a dog can't manage an estate." Bart nodded, flipping to the next page. "Indeed there is. I have been appointed as Max's guardian and will oversee the estate on his behalf. All decisions regarding Max's care and the management of the estate will be made in his best interest." Charles leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "And who decides what's in the dog's best interest, Higgins?" "You." "That's correct," Bart replied, meeting Charles's gaze steadily. "As per Archibald's wishes, I will act as Max's advocate and ensure that he is well cared for." The tension in the room was palpable as Charles and Bart locked eyes, engaged in a silent battle of wills. It was Veronica who finally broke the standoff, her laugh high and brittle. "Well, this is all very amusing," she said, standing and smoothing her designer dress. "Archie always did have a peculiar sense of humor. But surely, Bart, you can see how ridiculous this is. There must be some way to contest the will." Bart closed the folder and returned it to his briefcase. "The will is ironclad, Mrs. Finch. Archibald was very clear about his wishes, and everything is in order legally. Unless you can prove that he was not of sound mind when he made these decisions, I'm afraid there's nothing to contest." Charles's hands clenched into fists, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "We'll see about that, Higgins. This isn't over." As the family filed out of the room, their angry mutters echoing through the hallway, Bart remained seated, a troubled expression on his face. He had known Archie for decades and understood the reasoning behind this unusual bequest. It was a test, a final attempt to see if his family could rise above their greed and show the kindness and compassion that Archie had always hoped to instill in them. But as Bart recalled the cold calculation in Charles's eyes, he feared that Archie's plan might backfire spectacularly. He made a mental note to keep a close watch on the Finch family in the coming weeks. Something told him that they wouldn't take this perceived slight lying down. As he packed up his briefcase, a gentle whine caught Bart's attention. Max, Archie's loyal companion, padded into the room, his tail wagging hesitantly. The dog's soulful brown eyes seemed to hold a question, as if he sensed the tension that still lingered in the air. Bart knelt down, scratching behind Max's ears. "Don't worry, old boy," he murmured. "I promised Archie I'd look after you, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." But as he spoke the words, Bart couldn't shake the feeling that keeping that promise might prove to be far more challenging and dangerous than he had ever anticipated. The battle for Archibald Finch's fortune had only just begun, and Max, the unwitting heir, was caught in the crosshairs. The days following the reading of Archibald Finch's will brought a palpable change to the once stately mansion. Where warmth and laughter had once filled the halls, a cold, oppressive silence now reigned. At the center of this shifting atmosphere was Max, the unwitting heir to a fortune he couldn't comprehend. Max's world had been turned upside down. The gentle hands that once stroked his golden fur were now clenched in anger, and the voices that had showered him with affection now dripped with barely concealed malice. The loyal retriever, sensing the hostility that surrounded him, began to withdraw into himself. One particularly gloomy afternoon, Max padded into the kitchen, his nails clicking softly on the marble floor. His water bowl sat empty, as it had for hours. Thirst burned in his throat as he approached Veronica, who stood at the counter, scrolling through her phone. Max whined softly, nudging Veronica's leg with his nose. She glanced down, her lips curling in disgust. "Get away from me, you mangy mutt," she hissed, shoving him with her foot. Max stumbled backward, confusion and hurt evident in his soulful brown eyes. He slunk away, tail tucked between his legs, and curled up in a corner of the room. Charles entered the kitchen, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "Has that flea-bitten mongrel eaten yet?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Veronica shook her head, a cruel smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Not a bite, and I made sure to put his food just out of reach. It's driving him mad." Charles nodded approvingly. "Good. The sooner that mutt keels over, the better. I can't believe my father left everything to a dog. It's insulting." As they spoke, neither noticed Max's ears perk up, listening intently to their conversation. Though he couldn't understand the words, the malice in their tones sent a shiver down his spine. The neglect continued for days. Max's once lustrous coat became dull and matted. His ribs began to show through his skin, and his usual boundless energy dwindled to nothing. He spent most of his time huddled in corners, trying to avoid the hostile glares and cruel words of the family. One night, as Max lay curled up on the cold floor of the foyer, he heard the creak of a door opening. His ears pricked up, hope fluttering in his chest. Perhaps someone had come to feed him, to show him kindness. Instead, he saw Tiffany and Chad creeping down the stairs, mischievous grins on their faces. In Chad's hand was a small remote control, and trailing behind him was a toy car. "Watch this," Chad whispered, setting the car down and flicking a switch. The car roared to life, zipping across the floor straight towards Max. Startled, Max leapt to his feet, backing away from the approaching toy. But Tiffany and Chad weren't done. They steered the car in circles around Max, laughing as the confused and frightened dog spun in circles, trying to escape. "Look at him dance!" Tiffany cackled, her eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. Max, panicked and disoriented, backed into a corner. The toy car continued to buzz around him. Its mechanical were mixing with the siblings' laughter to create a cacophony of terror for the poor dog. Suddenly, a door slammed upstairs. Tiffany and Chad froze, quickly scooping up the toy car and darting back to their rooms, leaving Max trembling in the corner. As the days wore on, strange occurrences began to plague the mansion. Doors would creak open in the dead of night, startling Max from his fitful sleep. Objects would go missing, only to reappear in odd places. Whispers seemed to echo through the empty hallways, sending chills down Max's spine. One particularly dark night, Max was jolted awake by a crash from the kitchen. His ears perked up, and despite his fear, curiosity drew him towards the sound. As he crept into the kitchen, his nose twitched at an unfamiliar scent. There, illuminated by the pale moonlight streaming through the window, stood Veronica. She was hunched over Max's food bowl, a small vial in her hand. As Max watched, she tipped the contents of the vial into his food, stirring it with a spoon. A low growl rumbled in Max's chest. Veronica spun around, her eyes wide with surprise and guilt. For a moment, they stared at each other, the air thick with tension. Then Max lunged forward, teeth bared. He snapped at Veronica's hand, barely missing her fingers as she jerked away. The food bowl clattered to the floor, its contents spilling across the tiles. "You vicious beast!" Veronica shrieked, her face contorted with rage. She grabbed a nearby broom, swinging it at Max. "I'll teach you to bare your teeth at me." Max dodged the first swing, but the second caught him on the side. He yelped in pain, backing away from the enraged woman. But Veronica wasn't finished. She advanced on Max, broom raised high. "Veronica, what's going on?" Charles's voice boomed from the doorway. Veronica lowered the broom, her chest heaving. "This monster tried to attack me," she lied smoothly. "I was just defending myself." Charles's eyes narrowed as he looked from Veronica to the cowering Max. Without a word, he strode forward and grabbed Max by the scruff of his neck. The dog whimpered, trying to wriggle free, but Charles's grip was like iron. "I think it's time our little heir had a timeout," Charles growled, dragging Max from the kitchen. Max's nails scrabbled against the floor as Charles pulled him down the hallway and towards a door he had never been allowed to approach before. With a creak, Charles wrenched the door open, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. "Sweet dreams, you mangy mutt," Charles sneered, shoving Max down the stairs. The dog tumbled down, yelping with each painful impact, until he landed in a heap at the bottom. The door slammed shut, plunging Max into total darkness. The basement was damp and cold, filled with unfamiliar smells and sounds that set Max's nerves on edge. He limped to a corner, curling up as tightly as he could, and whimpered softly. Hours passed, each one feeling like an eternity to the frightened dog. The darkness pressed in on him, and strange noises echoed through the basement, making Max flinch and tremble. As dawn broke, a thin shaft of light pierced the darkness, streaming through a small, grimy window near the ceiling. Max's eyes, adjusted to the dark, followed the beam of light. It illuminated a stack of boxes beneath the window, creating a makeshift staircase. Hope flickered in Max's chest. Gathering what little strength he had left, he limped towards the boxes. Each step was agony, his body protesting after days of neglect and abuse. But the promise of escape drove him forward. Max scrambled up the boxes, his claws scrabbling for purchase on the cardboard. At last, he reached the window. It was shut tight, but age had weakened the latch. With a desperate push of his nose, Max felt the window give way. Fresh air rushed in, carrying with it the sense of freedom. Max wriggled through the narrow opening, ignoring the scrape of rough wood against his sides. With a final push, he tumbled out onto the dew-covered grass. For a moment, Max lay there, panting heavily. Then, driven by instinct and fear, he struggled to his feet. With one last look at the mansion that had become his prison, Max turned and ran, disappearing into the early morning mist. Inside the mansion, the Finch family woke to an unusual silence. No patting of paws, no jingle of a collar. Veronica was the first to notice, a triumphant smile spreading across her face as she realized Max was nowhere to be found. "Charles," she called, barely containing her glee. "I think our little problem has solved itself." Charles hurried down the stairs, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Are you sure?" Veronica nodded, gesturing around the empty house. "Not a trace of him. He must have run off in the night." A slow, cruel smile spread across Charles's face. Well, it seems fortune favors us after all. We'd better call Higgins, put on a good show of concern for our poor, lost dog." As the family gathered in the living room, their faces masks of false worry, none of them noticed the small red light blinking in the corner of the room. Hidden behind a vase, a tiny camera captured their every word and gesture, silently bearing witness to their true nature. Miles away, in a modest office, Bartholomew Higgins leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on a computer screen. He watched the Finch family's performance with a mixture of disgust and sadness. Archie had been right about them after all. Bart's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. He answered it, his voice weary. Higgins speaking. "Mr. Higgins?" A gentle female voice came through the speaker. "This is Sarah from the Oakville Animal Shelter. I'm calling about a dog that was brought in this morning. His collar says his name is Max, and your number was on the tag." Bart sat up straight, his heart racing. "Is he all right?" "He's a bit worse for wear," Sarah replied, concern evident in her voice. "But he's safe now. Can you come down to the shelter?" "I'll be there right away," Bart said, already reaching for his coat. As he hurried out of his office, Bart's mind raced. Max was safe, but the battle was far from over. The Finch family's true colors had been revealed, and now it was up to him to ensure that justice was served. For Max, for Archie, and for all those who believed in the power of compassion over greed. Bartholomew Higgins sat in his dimly lit office, his eyes fixed on the array of monitors before him. Each screen displayed a different room in the Finch mansion, silent witnesses to the family's increasingly brazen behavior. Bart had installed these hidden cameras days ago, driven by a growing suspicion that the Finches would stop at nothing to claim Archie's fortune. What he saw chilled him to the bone. On one screen, Charles and Veronica lounged in the study, glasses of expensive whiskey in hand. Their faces were alight with cruel satisfaction as they discussed their plans for the inheritance. "I can't believe how easy it was," Charles chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "That mutt didn't stand a chance against us." Veronica leaned in, her voice dripping with malice. "And now, darling, we can finally live the life we deserve. No more pretending to care about Archie's ridiculous animal charities." Bart's hands clenched in a fist, his knuckles turning white. He had known the Finches were greedy, but this level of callousness surpassed even his worst expectations. As he watched, Chad and Tiffany joined their parents, eagerly discussing how they would spend their share of the fortune. "I'm buying a yacht," Chad declared, sprawling across an antique chaise lounge. "Maybe two." Tiffany rolled her eyes. "Please, I'm going to open my own fashion line. It'll make those animal-loving hippies Archie supported look like paupers." The family's laughter echoed through Bart's speakers, a discordant symphony of greed and entitlement. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. How could Archie's own flesh and blood be so devoid of compassion? Just as Bart was about to turn away, unable to stomach any more, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. With a weary sigh, he answered. "Bartholomew Higgins speaking." "Mr. Higgins?" A gentle female voice came through the speaker. "This is Sarah from the Oakville Animal Shelter. I'm calling about a dog that was brought in this morning. His caller says his name is Max, and your number was listed as the emergency contact." Bart's heart leapt into his throat. "Max? Is he all right?" Sarah's voice softened with concern. "He's safe now, but he's in pretty rough shape. Looks like he's been neglected and possibly abused. We were hoping you could come down to the shelter and help us figure out what happened." "I'll be there right away," Bart said, already reaching for his coat. As he hurried out of his office, a mix of relief and dread churned in his stomach. Max was alive, but the evidence of the Finches' cruelty was now undeniable. The animal shelter was a modest building on the outskirts of town, its walls adorned with colorful paw prints and hopeful adoption posters. As Bart pushed open the door, the cacophony of barks and meows washed over him. Sarah, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, greeted him at the reception desk. "Mr. Higgins? Thank you for coming so quickly. Max is in the back. I have to warn you, he's pretty shaken up." She led Bart through a corridor lined with kennels, each housing a hopeful furry face. At the end of the hall, in a quiet corner, lay Max. The once proud golden retriever was a shadow of his former self. His golden coat was matted and dull, his ribs visible beneath his skin. But it was the look in his eyes that broke Bart's heart, a mixture of fear and resignation that spoke volumes about the ordeal he had endured. "Oh, Max," Bart whispered, kneeling beside the kennel. Max's tail gave a weak thump against the floor, a ghost of his usual enthusiastic greeting. Sarah knelt beside Bart, her voice soft with concern. "Can you tell me what happened to him? When he was brought in, I could hardly believe it was the same dog I'd seen in the papers just a few weeks ago." Bart's mind raced. He couldn't reveal the full truth about Archie's will and the Finches' plot, not without proof. But he also couldn't let Max's abusers go unpunished. "There's been a family dispute," he said carefully. "Max was caught in the middle of it. I had no idea things had gotten this bad." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing there was more to the story. "Mr. Higgins, if Max has been abused, we need to report it. No animal deserves to suffer like this." Bart nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "You're right, of course. But first, I need to confront the people responsible. Can you keep Max here safe for a little while longer?" Sarah agreed, though reluctance was clear in her eyes. As Bart left the shelter, his resolve hardened. It was time to face the Finches and put an end to their cruel scheme. The drive back to the mansion felt interminable. Bart's mind whirled with the evidence he had gathered: the video footage, Max's condition, the family's own incriminating words. Surely, it would be enough to see justice done. As he pulled up to the grand house, Bart steeled himself for the confrontation ahead. He marched up to the front door and rang the bell, the chimes echoing ominously through the mansion. Charles answered, his face twisting into a sneer when he saw Bart. "What do you want, Higgins? Come to congratulate us on our impending windfall?" "I know what you did to Max," Bart said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I have proof." Charles's sneer faltered for a moment before he recovered, ushering Bart inside with false hospitality. "I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about. We've been sick with worry since Max disappeared." The rest of the family gathered in the living room, their faces masks of feigned concern. Bart stood before them, feeling like a prosecutor facing a jury of the guilty. "I've just come from the animal shelter," Bart began, his voice steady despite the anger boiling inside him. "Max is there, half-starved and traumatized. Care to explain how that happened under your watch?" Veronica gasped dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest. "Oh, how awful. We had no idea. We've been searching everywhere for him." Bart's patience snapped. He pulled out his tablet, queuing up the damning footage from the hidden cameras. "Enough lies. I have video evidence of your neglect and abuse. I've heard you plotting to spend Archie's money as if Max were already dead." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Charles's face contorted with rage, while Veronica's eyes darted around, looking for an escape. Tiffany and Chad exchanged panicked glances. "You had no right to spy on us," Charles roared, lunging forward. His fist connected with Bart's jaw, sending the older man stumbling backward. Chaos erupted. Veronica screamed. Tiffany and Chad shouted accusations, and Charles advanced on Bart, fists raised for another blow. But before he could strike again, the front door burst open. Sarah from the animal shelter stood in the doorway, her phone in hand. "I called the police," she announced, her voice steady despite the scene before her. "They're on their way." The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements and legal jargon. Bart presented his evidence. Sarah corroborated Max's condition, and the Finch's carefully constructed facade crumbled around them. But just when it seemed justice would prevail, the lead detective pulled Bart aside, his expression grim. "Mr. Higgins, I'm afraid we have a problem," he said, his voice low. "The evidence you've gathered, it's compelling, but it was obtained illegally. Those hidden cameras? Without a warrant. That footage is inadmissible in court." Bart felt the ground drop out from under him. But what about Max? Surely his condition is evidence enough? The detective shook his head. Animal abuse cases are notoriously difficult to prove, especially when the animal in question is worth millions. The Finches have already called their lawyer. Without concrete, legally obtained evidence, there's not much we can do. As the police left, the Finches' smug expressions returned. Charles approached Bart, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "Nice try, old man, but you can't beat us. That fortune is as good as ours." Bart watched helplessly as the family retreated into the mansion, their laughter echoing mockingly in his ears. He had failed. Failed Max, failed Archie, failed justice itself. With a heavy heart, Bart returned to the animal shelter. Sarah was waiting for him, her face etched with concern. "What happened?" she asked, leading him to Max's kennel. Bart sank down beside the recovering dog, burying his face in his hands. "They're going to get away with it," he said, his voice breaking. "All that cruelty, all that greed, and there's nothing we can do to stop them." Max whined softly, sensing Bart's distress. He inched closer, resting his head on Bart's knee. Despite everything he had been through, the dog still had the capacity for comfort and compassion. As Bart stroked Max's head, feeling the warmth of the dog's unconditional love, he made a silent vow. He wouldn't give up. Somehow, someway, he would find a way to expose the Finch's true nature and ensure that Archie's fortune went to those who truly deserved it. Little did Bart know that fate, and Archie himself, had one last surprise in store. A twist that would turn the tables on the greedy Finches and prove once and for all that love, loyalty, and compassion were the true measures of wealth. Bart Higgins sat beside Max's kennel, his weathered hands gently stroking the golden retriever's fur. The once vibrant dog had regained some of his strength under Sarah's care, but his eyes still held a shadow of the trauma he'd endured. "I'm so sorry, old boy," Bart murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I promised Archie I'd look after you, and I've failed miserably. Max whined softly, sensing Bart's distress. He inched closer, resting his head on Bart's knee. Even after all he'd been through, Max still had the capacity for comfort and compassion. Bart felt a lump form in his throat. You're a better soul than any of us deserve, Max. If only there was some way to make this right, to show the world what those Finches really are. Well, it's about time someone figured that out. A familiar voice interrupted, causing Bart to nearly jump out of his skin. There, standing in the doorway of the shelter's back room, was Archibald Finch himself. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, his trademark tweed jacket a bit rumpled, but his eyes twinkled with the same mischievous light Bart remembered so well. "Hey, Archie," Bart stammered, his mind reeling. "But you're dead," Archie chuckled, stepping into the room. "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, old friend. Though I must say, playing dead has been quite the adventure." Max's reaction was instantaneous. With a joyful bark, he bounded out of his kennel, nearly knocking Archie over in his enthusiasm. Archie laughed, kneeling down to embrace his faithful companion. "Max, old boy, what are you doing here?" Archie's voice softened as he took in Max's condition. "Oh, my dear friend, what have they done to you?" Sarah, drawn by the commotion, appeared in the doorway. Her eyes widened in shock as she recognized the supposedly deceased millionaire. "Mr. Finch? But how?" Archie stood, keeping one hand on Max's head. "It's a long story, my dear, one that I think we all need to hear. But first, I believe some introductions are in order. You must be Sarah, the angel who's been caring for Max." Sarah nodded, still stunned. "Yes, sir. I don't understand. Everyone thought you were dead." "That was rather the point," Archie said with a wink. "Now, why don't we all sit down? I have quite a tale to tell, and I believe we have some wrongs to right." As they settled into Sarah's small office, Archie began his explanation. He'd long suspected that his family's affection was more for his money than for him, but he'd hoped he was wrong. The idea to fake his death and leave everything to Max had come to him as a way to test their true nature. "I installed hidden cameras throughout the mansion," Archie revealed, his expression growing somber. "I wanted to see how they'd treat Max when they thought no one was watching. I never imagined." His voice trailed off, his hand instinctively reaching out to stroke Max's fur. Bart leaned forward, his mind racing. "But Archie, why didn't you step in sooner? Why let it go this far?" Archie sighed heavily. "I needed irrefutable proof, Bart. Not just for legal reasons, but for my own peace of mind. I wanted to give them every chance to do the right thing. But instead—" He shook his head, disappointment etched on his face. "The cameras," Bart muttered, realization dawning. "That's why my footage was inadmissible. Your cameras were already there, legally installed by the property owner." Archie nodded. "Exactly. And now, we have all the evidence we need to expose their true nature." Sarah, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "But Mr. Finch, what happens now? Surely you're not going to let them inherit after what they've done." A slow smile spread across Archie's face. "My dear, that's where you come in. You've shown more kindness and compassion in a short time you've known Max than my family has in years. Which is why I decided to alter my will." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. "This is my new will, drawn up and notarized this morning. It leaves the bulk of my fortune to this animal shelter, with you, Sarah, as its director." Sarah's jaw dropped. "Mr. Finch, I can't accept that. It's too much." Archie held up a hand. "Nonsense. You've proven that you understand the true value of wealth. Not in what it can buy, but in how it can help others. I can think of no better hands to entrust my legacy to." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as the magnitude of Archie's gift sank in. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise. I'll use it to help as many animals as I can." Bart, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "Archie, this is all well and good, but what about the Finches? They're not going to take this lying down." Archie's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Oh, I'm counting on that, old friend. In fact, I think it's time we paid them a visit. Care to join me for one last performance?" The drive to the Finch mansion was charged with anticipation. Archie sat in the back seat with Max, while Bart drove and Sarah nervously fidgeted in the passenger seat. As they pulled up to the grand house, they could see Charles and Veronica through the front window, apparently in the midst of a heated discussion. "Ready for the show?" Archie asked, a hint of his old humor returning. Without waiting for an answer, he strode up to the front door and rang the bell. The look on Charles's face when he opened the door was priceless. His jaw dropped, color draining from his face as if he'd seen a ghost, which in a way he had. "Hello, son," Archie said calmly. "I believe we have some matters to discuss." What followed was a scene of chaos and recrimination. Veronica screamed, Tiffany and Chad cowered in corners, and Charles alternated between sputtering denials and hurling accusations. Archie, however, remained unflappable. He calmly presented the evidence from his hidden cameras, detailing every cruel act and greedy conversation. The Finches' protests grew weaker and weaker as the weight of their actions crashed down upon them. "How could you?" Charles finally spat, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and shame. "Your own family." Archie's voice was steady, but tinged with sadness. "Family, Charles, is more than blood. It's about love, loyalty, and compassion, qualities you've shown a distinct lack of." He gestured to Sarah and Max. "These two have shown more of those qualities in a few weeks than you have in years. Which is why they, along with this young lady's animal shelter, will be inheriting my fortune." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles and Veronica exchanged panicked glances, the reality of their situation sinking in. "You can't do this!" Veronica shrieked, her carefully maintained composure crumbling. "We'll contest the will." Bart stepped forward, a satisfied smile on his face. "I'm afraid you'll find that quite impossible, Mrs. Finch. The will is ironclad, and we have ample evidence of your attempts to circumvent Mr. Finch's wishes. Should you choose to pursue legal action, I believe you'll find yourselves facing some rather serious criminal charges." The fight seemed to drain out of the Finches all at once. They slumped onto the opulent sofa, the weight of their actions and the consequences finally hitting home. Archie surveyed the scene with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I had hoped, even until the end, that you might prove me wrong, that you might show some glimmer of the love and compassion I tried to instill in you. But you've made your choices, and now you must live with them." He turned to Sarah, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. "My dear, I believe we have some paperwork to sign. Shall we?" As they prepared to leave, Max padded over to Charles and Veronica. For a moment, it seemed the dog might offer some form of forgiveness. Instead, he lifted his leg and promptly relieved himself on Charles's expensive Italian leather shoes. Archie couldn't suppress a chuckle. "Well said, old friend. Well said indeed." In the days that followed, the story of Archibald Finch's miraculous return and the exposure of his family's greed made headlines across the country. The Finches, their reputation in tatters, retreated from public life, left with nothing but the bitter taste of their own avarice. Sarah, true to her word, transformed the small local shelter into a state-of-the-art animal welfare center. Under her compassionate leadership, countless animals found loving homes and received the care they desperately needed. As for Archie and Max, they settled into a comfortable retirement, dividing their time between volunteering at the shelter and embarking on new adventures. Their bond, tested by fire, emerged stronger than ever. One sunny afternoon, as Archie and Max sat on the porch of their new, more modest home, Bart stopped by for a visit. "You know, Archie," Bart mused, watching Max chase butterflies in the garden, "I've been your lawyer for decades, but I never thought I'd see the day when a dog inherited a fortune and ended up saving an entire family's soul." Archie chuckled, his eyes twinkling with their old mischief. "Well, Bart, as I've always said, sometimes it takes a dog to teach humans about humanity." He whistled, and Max bounded over, tail wagging furiously. Archie scratched behind the dog's ears, his voice softening. "Well, Max, old boy, it seems we've taught those vultures a lesson they won't soon forget. From now on, it's just you and me and a whole lot of furry friends to share our lives with." He glanced at Bart and then towards the shelter in the distance, where Sarah could be seen playing with a group of rescued puppies. A warm smile spread across Archie's face. And of course, our new family. The one we chose, and the one that chose us right back. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the peaceful scene, Archie Finch realized that he had found something far more valuable than any fortune, a legacy of love, compassion, and loyalty that would endure long after he was gone. And at the heart of it all was Max, the dog who had inherited a fortune and given back something far more precious in return.